Welcome to the Mind and Matter podcast. I'm your host, Nick Jikomis, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Manoj Doss. Manoj is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research. He studies the effects on memory of different classes of psychoactive drugs, and we talked all about the effect of drugs on memory. We talked about different ways that memories are formed and consolidated and recalled in our minds and in our brains. We talked about the effects of drugs ranging from MDMA to psychedelics to THC and cannabinoids to alcohol and sedatives on memory in the human brain. Towards the end, we also discussed some of the latest research on psilocybin and its functional impacts on the brain and how Manoj thinks about that. So if you're interested in psychoactive drugs and different types of drugs and how they impact the human brain, and in particular how they impact memory, this will be an interesting episode for you. As always, if you enjoy the content on this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe wherever you're listening. That could be on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or another audio podcast directory. That could be on the video version on YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe to my free weekly newsletter at mindandmatter.com. You'll gain access to what upcoming guests and episodes will be about, content I'm writing on my Substack, and other interesting research highlights that I share with folks. And you can also sign up to be a paid subscriber if you want early access to episodes and to support the podcast even further. This episode is supported in part by Athletic Greens. Their main product, AG1, is a comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition product containing 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food-sourced ingredients with less than 1 gram of sugar per serving, no nasty chemicals or artificial anything. It's gluten and dairy-free and compatible with paleo, vegan, vegetarian, and ketogenic diets. AG1 is a quick and convenient way to supplement your diet to help ensure your body is getting the nutrients it needs. It comes in powder form, and you can mix it in water and drink it, or you can put it into a smoothie or a shake or something like that. I mix it into water and drink it with the first meal of each day, and it's super convenient. If you go to athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter, Athletic Greens will give you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Their vitamin D product comes in tincture form, so you just take 1 drop each day. A large fraction of the population is actually vitamin D deficient, especially in winter months when we get less sun exposure, and vitamin D is super important for the proper function of the immune system and for a variety of other things. And there's even evidence indicating that vitamin D deficiency is correlated with more severe cases of COVID-19 in those who get infected. Every time I go into the doctor each year for a checkup, I'm always told that vitamin D deficiency is very common and I should be supplementing on a daily basis. So visit athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter or click the link in the episode description. You'll get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D with your first purchase. Today's show is brought to you in part by Dosist, an all-natural cannabis company specializing in dose-controlled cannabis products made with plant-based ingredients. To learn more about Dosist, their products, and where they are available, please visit their website through the link in the episode description. And with that, here's my conversation with Dr. Manoj Doss. Dr. Manoj Doss, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me on here.
Can you start off by just describing for everyone who you are and what your scientific background is?
Yeah, so I'm a postdoc at the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. My background is essentially in psychopharmacology or neuropsychopharmacology and cognitive neuroscience. So I call it cognitive neuropsychopharmacology just to be complicated. And my training is really in episodic memory research and psychoactive drugs, although now I've sort of focused on psychedelics and other hallucinogens. But broadly speaking, my interests are in just various psychoactive drugs and how they impact cognition, especially episodic memory.
So let's break down some of the terminology for people before we get into memory stuff. So psychopharmacology, what is that?
I think this could mean a lot of things. A lot of times people will probably refer to how it impacts behavior. How drugs impact behavior. And so, or not, it doesn't even necessarily have to be. You could even look at like the neurotransmitters and how those impact behavior or cognition. So how they affect the mind. And a lot of times from behavior, we can then use that as a readout to infer what's going on in the mind. And so Yeah, I think that's approximately what some people would refer to as psychopharmacology. Episodic memory, I think that was probably one of the things that I should probably define. So there's been some debate these days as to how to really section up different aspects of memory, and I think it really helps to describe some other aspects of memory in order to kind of contextualize what episodic memory is, or what we think it might be. But so Endel Tolving, he kind of came up with this distinction between episodic memory and semantic memory. So episodic memory is what he refers to as like mental time travel. It's reliving, re-experiencing an event or information from the past. Whereas semantic memory is more kind of your fact-based information. So to give you, I think, an example people will always use is that you might remember, you might know that George Washington was the first president of the country, of the United States, but you don't remember where and when you learned that information. So you have the semantic memory, but you don't have the episodic memory. And it does kind of become tricky as to, what is semantic and what's episodic, because not everybody has the same types of semantic memory. So it might be a fact to me that I grew up in Texas, but obviously that's not a factual information to other people. And I think one way people have kind of distinguished these things is if you take out certain regions of the brain that tend to be particularly important to episodic memory, does the memory of some of this semantic-like information still remain? And so people could show that if you take out the hippocampus, people might still know where they grew up, which in other words, that information has become kind of semanticized, but it might be kind of devoid of certain details, like really certain detailed information, like where specifically in the city your house was, or specific details of the house, like colors and whatnot. So I mean, it's certainly not a perfect distinction, but both of these types of memories can also be distinguished from other types of memories, such as fear conditioning or kind of reward learning, which seem to be kind of more automatic. So for example, certain things might automatically trigger you and make your skin crawl. And that's due to a memory that's there, but it's not necessarily strictly due to the episodic memory. But again, all these things sort of interact, and it's not a perfect splitting up of the systems, but episodic memory is typically what we think of as the human sort of reliving of information from the past.
Yeah, it's always a little tricky to disentangle how much of this is semantic. When we talk about different forms of memory, how much of it is just sort of a linguistic convenience for us versus really being able to tie different forms of memory to distinct underlying biological mechanisms.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what the good thing about episodic memory is. And I'm going to double back on the statement in a second when we probably talk about some of my work. But one idea with episodic memory is that, it is somewhat reliant on the hippocampus. And so, without the hippocampus, you're not going to be able to encode new episodic memories, and even retrieving memories. Although people will say, you get some amount of retrograde amnesia. So in other words, information before your hippocampus was taken out, maybe from the first 2 years before, maybe some of that will be gone, but you do have these episodic memories of the past. And more recently, people have argued that actually, well, those memories that these hippocampal amnesic patients have are not quite episodic. They tend to be more semanticized. They tend to be kind of ambiguous, vague, and not as specific as somebody who might have a hippocampus and can kind of recreate some of that information of the past and use that information to give you more kind of details. And I mean, I think that what's also important is that all memory is kind of, at least episodic memory, is kind of a reconstructive process. And by having something like a hippocampus and filling in gaps that should be there, we might also be allowing our memories to become distorted too. And I mean, there's some evidence actually that patients with amnesia might not have as distortive memories of the past, of the things that they can remember that are semanticized. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to things like, fear conditioning, I think you can show that, for example, the amygdala seems to be pretty important for that. Without an amygdala, it can be difficult to fear condition somebody. With something like procedural learning. So this would be like learning to ride a bike. You can In fact, people have done the studies with hippocampal patients, and I think they'll do mirror drawing. So if all you can see is the mirror and your hand drawing what's in the mirror, it can be quite difficult to learn to do that skill. You have to do everything kind of backwards and map on what's going on in the mirror to your hand. And what's interesting is I think amnesic patients can learn that task over, a few sessions, just like your average person. I don't even know if their rate of learning is that much slower. But more than likely, my guess is by the 10th session, they're going to be like, man, I'm pretty good at this for doing it for the first time, even though because they can't remember the episode during which they were performing this task, during which they were getting practice, the multiple episodes. So there's, kind of I think that when it comes to the brain, I mean, this is one situation which I think the brain does a decent job at kind of parsing up what we know about the mind. I've argued a lot that, maybe I haven't argued a lot, maybe more recently, I've argued that, for example, fMRI hasn't really taught us that much as we think we know about the mind, and that a lot of the things that we've gotten from fMRI aren't even necessary, that we could have done all these things without it, just using, sophisticated behavioral paradigms. But the brain knowledge here really does kind of constrain some of the what we know. And I think it's, I think this is a situation where it's not perfect. Again, all these systems interact, and there's ideas of statistical learning, and the hippocampus can perform statistical learning. And that's not exactly an episodic memory by any means. So not perfect, but I think it's not a bad distinction for now.
Yeah. So before we dig into memory stuff and the effects of drugs, let's unpack a few more things for people. So one thing that I think is really important to go over up front here are the sort of different phases of memory. So people often distinguish between encoding, consolidation, and retrieval. So can you unpack and describe what those are for people?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because that's become a huge part of my work from even back at my PhD work. So so encoding is essentially the formation of memory traces, although it's still kind of you might still be forming them when you retrieve them as well. But it's the idea that you're taking information in and coding them in some ways such that the brain can subsequently represent them. You could say it's the learning phase even, but the word learning is sort of especially used more by non-episodic memory researchers. And so, encoding is kind of, I think, the word that for any type of memory, you could say that you're encoding something. Consolidation. So there's two meanings of the word consolidation. And I'm more using it in terms of the cellular term, the cellular version of it, rather than the systems version. So cellular consolidation is essentially the phase after which, so synapses can be strengthened or weakened. And then there's maybe an hour to 6 hours, something along those lines, during which they need to be stabilized. And so that's what some people refer to as cellular consolidation. Or synaptic consolidation. And a lot of times you can administer a drug immediately after encoding, and you can mess with this consolidation process. So that's probably going to be more related to cellular consolidation. There is this idea of systems consolidation. And systems consolidation is more of this idea that you're transferring memories from a temporary store to a more permanent store. So for example, the hippocampus, it encodes memories. And I was talking about this idea of memories becoming semanticized over time, how they can be less episodic and more kind of fact-like. And that if you take your hippocampus out, you'll still have it. That's the idea of transferring memories from the hippocampus to the cortex. Now, there's been recent disagreement as to whether or not systems consolidation even exists. Part of the debate is whether or not those memories are qualitatively the same without the hippocampus. So the idea is that essentially you have the hippocampus, it points to various regions of the cortex, sort of like an index. And the memories are really coming from, I guess you might say, the cortex, or the experiences of memories are coming from the cortex, but the hippocampus kind of binds everything together. And after you activate these memories enough over time, they can become independent of the hippocampus. And so some will say, well, they're independent of the hippocampus, but they're still basically the same. And so others have now argued that, no, that's not true. And that really one reason that memories can essentially slip away, or, it's not that they don't get consolidated, is rather there's an interference that has to do with the context, contextual interference. And this is like going way deeper into the wormhole than I probably was initially wanting to go into. But Yeah, I don't know about semantic memory, and anything that I talk about here about enhancing, for example, memory from post-encoding drugs is really, I'm talking about cellular consolidation and not whether or not these memories are becoming more semanticized and whether or not they're transferring from the hippocampus to the cortex or not. And then lastly, there's retrieval. So retrieval is when you're retrieving a memory. So when you're remembering something. And so one of the big points here when you're talking about drugs and different phases, this is a problem that's existed throughout like psychopharmacology research since, for a while now. And it's really unfortunate that what seems like such a simple idea has become overlooked and people have missed really interesting effects. So you can administer a drug and then give somebody an encoding phase. And so you show them a bunch of stimuli like pictures, for example. Show you a picture of a bottle. I show you a picture of a card. I show you a picture of a piece of paper, et cetera. And then later on, you can have some waiting period, or you can test their memory immediately afterwards. But if you test their memory immediately afterwards, you gave them a drug and it's impacting the encoding phase and you test their memory immediately afterwards, you're now going to be likely to impact the retrieval phase when their memories are going to be tested. You're also potentially affecting the consolidation phase, and it's hard not to impact the consolidation phase because most drug effects persist beyond this encoding phase, right? And so what you can do at least to dissociate effects on consolidation is you can show what happens when you give a drug immediately before encoding. And then you can show what happens when you give a drug immediately post-encoding. And then again, if you test their memory immediately afterwards, you're going to run the risk of impacting the retrieval phase. So usually what you should do is probably have like a 24-hour or 48-hour delay, or even some people will do 5 days or 1 week. And then you're very unlikely to be impacting the retrieval phase because all the drug effects have washed out. And then finally, you have your retrieval phase. And so you can have an encoding phase. If you give a drug immediately post-encoding, you're going to impact probably the consolidation phase. And then you test their memory, you're probably going to impact both the consolidation and retrieval phase. So instead, encode, 48 hours later, test their memory. But before you test their memory, right before, give them a drug. And that is now going to impact strictly the retrieval phase. So I think there's been a lot of, I think I can use the best example would be probably with cannabis.
Before we go into some of those examples, let's just kind of summarize for people. So encoding, consolidation, and retrieval. Encoding is basically you're learning something new. The information is being taken in by your mind. The brain is doing something to encode that information, and it may or may not be consolidated. You may or may not remember it later. So, if you try to teach me something, whatever that may be, I'll sit here and pay attention to it. I'll learn it with the intention to learn it, to try and remember it. I will then say, go home and sleep on it overnight. The next day, I may or may not remember everything I learned. Some of it I may remember, some of it I may not. That general process, which is usually happening in the hours after you learn it, is called consolidation, and it involves the strengthening or weakening of synapses, basically. And that will, at least in part, determine whether or not what you originally encoded stays in memory, i.e. it's been consolidated.
Yeah, I think it's more the stabilization of the strengthening and weakening of synapses. But yeah, exactly. And it's also the case that you can also just not encode things and not remember them for that reason. But we do try to have people perform certain tasks during the encoding phase to make sure that the stimuli were attended to. And this is actually a criticism from people who don't like experimental psychology. They'll say you give people a drug and it's garbage in, garbage out, and it's like, they're just generalized. It's funny because some of these people will say with psychedelics, there's generalized disengagement. That's probably true of all drugs. Like, this is what I refer to as psychedelic myopia. I think that all drugs will probably make people somewhat disengaged, but we do try to have them perform certain tasks during encoding to make sure that they were encoded. And then, as you said, then it's the issue of how well do they consolidate later. And a lot of times there's an interaction between encoding and consolidation, but then, keep going. And then your last phase would be retrieval, right?
Yeah. So in a lot of the work that you've done and others have done that we'll talk about, right, there's this challenge of, okay, if you want to understand how a particular kind of drug affects memory, you've got to be careful about if you're giving the drug, early or later in the learning process. Are you giving it during encoding? Are you giving it during consolidation? Are you giving it during retrieval on a subsequent day, say? And part of the challenge there is that the drugs are, if you give someone a drug, whether it's a sedative or a stimulant or whatever that we'll talk about, they will tend to be in your system for hours at a time. So you have to be very careful about when you administer that drug, whether it's at the beginning during encoding, whether it's during the consolidation phase. And that's basically what you're starting to say, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, sometimes I think it's impossible to decouple encoding from consolidation, for example. Even if your drug wears off halfway through the encoding phase, it was still on board during the first half of the stimuli that you showed somebody. Unless you, like, I think like optogenetics probably in animals would be the one way to differentiate things, where you can literally just turn on a set of neurons, for example, in the moment that something is being encoded, and then immediately silence it. But that's not something we can do in humans. But as I said, I think you can see what happens when you strictly impact something like consolidation to show that, hey, look, the effect is far different from what we get when we administer something during encoding. And then you can say that, okay, here's what happens in coding. Here's this completely different effect that we get at consolidation. These are dissociable.
I see. So we'll speak a lot about episodic memory in particular. And just as a reminder, I think you said episodic memory is basically it's tied to the ability to do basically mental time travel, to remember where you were, when you were. So there's a sort of spatial and temporal quality to it that you can, you put yourself in some time in the past when you learned something, or project yourself into the future and things like this.
Hold on 1 second. My partner's asking me a question. I know that this is. Cool. I'm back. Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's mental time travel. It's the reliving of information from the past to be differentiated from something like, procedural learning, where you can learn to ride a bike. And, in fact, a lot of times I think people have shown that if you try to use episodic memory for certain skills, like, okay, if I swung last time a little bit in the wrong direction, if I just go a little bit higher and you're a pro at this, you can actually, make yourself worse. A lot of times you should rely on your procedural memory system and not use your episodic system, at least for professionals in some of these sorts of areas. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's that last thing you said is probably intuitive to a lot of people, right? The idea of you're learning a new skill, or you're using a skill that you already know, the idea of overthinking it.
Right. Yeah. And I think, it is interesting because I think it's Anna Shapiro who was showing that with certain types of motor learning, that you initially, when you're learning them, you do use something like the hippocampus. Whether or not you're actually explicitly using episodic memory is probably unclear in a task like that. But my guess is when you're initially learning, you're using it a little bit more, but when you get better at it, it might start to interfere. And exactly, it's like you're overthinking it. And there's probably certain stages throughout a learning where sometimes use it, sometimes don't. And then, eventually it becomes this trade-off. And then eventually you probably shouldn't use it much at all. But yeah, here I'll be talking about episodic memory. And I guess just to complicate things further, there's going to be two processes we think about in episodic memory. And one of them is recollection, which I think is more of our standard way of thinking about retrieving information from the past. So where and when information, so I might, for example, see you one day at a conference, and I'm going to think to myself, I can remember that I met you on this podcast. I can, that you had the PCal and TCal in the back, in your back room. I can remember that you did your PhD in 2016, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all details of recollections that I can, recapitulate from, when I initially encoded them. Familiarity, though, is this weird sort of form of memory. You might think it kind of sits between almost semantic memory and episodic memory. It's almost like the recent activation of a semantic memory, or perhaps even certain perceptual features. And so it's more of just this feeling of knowing without having any kind of corroborating evidence. And typically these things co-occur, familiarity and recollection. And I think that sometimes the way I describe familiarity might not necessarily be the same way that other dual process theorists describe familiarity. So, don't take my word for exactly what it is, to go do your own research. But familiarity is this feeling of knowing. And so, So, one distinguishing thing that Tolving said was that episodic memory involves autonoetic consciousness. So placing yourself in, a given situation. And this could be even autonoetic consciousness can even be, for example, future simulation. So thinking about what you'll do in the future and placing yourself in that situation. Whereas semantic memory doesn't involve the sense of self, right? It involves this kind of universal fact. And so familiarity is also, if you ask me, involved in basically this noetic consciousness, this feeling of knowing that something is there without any kind of corroborating evidence. Mm-hmm. And, what's interesting is that people under psychedelics, they talk about, the self being dissolved, but then yet there being this noetic quality. And as we'll discuss, to some degree, recollection's impaired under psychedelics, familiarity is either spared or even enhanced. And so there is this feeling of knowing that I think comes with familiarity. And it's interesting. I guess maybe I should give you the example of how you can be familiar in the absence of recollection. Mm-hmm. So I gave you that example of I can remember where, when, et cetera, if I see you at a conference. Well, there's also the situation I think we've all had where I can remember, where I can see your face and say, you know what, you seem highly familiar, but I can't remember where I met you, when I met you, what your name is. No details come to mind. I think we've all experienced that. And that's like an example of familiarity in the absence of recollection. Another example that I think, and that's one example that everybody always uses. Another example that I've sort of gone through is when you watch a movie. I don't always remember the movies I watch very well, and yet I'll see a movie sometimes and be like, oh, wait a minute, I've seen this before. Or actually, this happens with Adventure Time. I watch the show Adventure Time all the time, and the episodes are really short. They're not really linear. And so it's kind of hard to always put that together into a single sort of narrative. And then I'll be like, man, I've seen this episode before, yet I can't predict what's about to happen at the very end. And then there's a complete surprise that happens at the very end, and everybody around me might be surprised. And I'll be like, not surprised, by the twist, because it felt familiar in the absence of being able to actually recollect what was going to happen at that end.
Yeah, and I think this is another case where this will be very familiar to a lot of people, this distinction, whether or not they've formalized it in their mind, recollection compared to familiarity. Like if you ask me who was the first president of the United States and I say George Washington, I'm clearly and accurately recollecting a fact that I've stored in memory. But then you might ask me, who was the second president? And I might say, I don't remember. But then you say something like, was John Adams the second president? And I immediately go, yes, he definitely was. Like I recognize it when you say it that way, like I'm familiar with that fact, even though I couldn't recollect it.
Yeah. And I think, and that's exactly that kind of situation. You were familiar with it. But again, I get that's sort of interesting where you're kind of getting at this idea of, well, it's a semantic memory that you didn't have access to, and you didn't have a recent recollection to maybe bootstrap off of the semantic memory. This is where you're kind of maybe getting interaction between semantic memory and episodic memory. So if I took your hippocampus out, chances are you still would know that Adams was the second president. Which case it's sort of the semantic memory, but that the access to that information wasn't easily there. But if you'd had an episode at which you were recalling and recollecting, you could recollect the episode of using the semantic memory, of retrieving that semantic memory. Now you can kind of use recollection to help cue your semantic memory. And so, there's kind of again, this is where I think that distinction, can get a little murky. And what this, familiarity thing is sometimes it's also just the ease at which you process information. So, even just seeing for example, if I walk you through a layout of a house and you've never been there before, but you're like, man, this feels oddly familiar. It might be because this layout of the house is exactly the same as something as, your own house, except I have different things. Instead of having a painting in that corner, I have a hole in the wall. Instead of having, a fireplace here, I have a litter box for a cat or something. And it's like the same spatial layout, but there's just kind of different sort of features. And then there could be something familiar because it's this ease with which you process that information. And so there is this idea that fluency of processing, whether that's perceptual or conceptual, feeds into this feeling of familiarity. And I think one more thing I wanted to mention is that you can get this familiarity in the absence of recollection. And you can also get recollection in the absence of familiarity. And I think the best, example of that is patients with Capgras syndrome. And so, I might see you one day and be like, you know what, I can remember that we did this podcast together and that you had PCAL, TCAL in the background, but you don't feel familiar and therefore you're an imposter, or you must be the twin, or something like that, right? And that's actually something that people will go through. And so it's kind of this, usually these processes don't decouple, because when they do, you get some bizarre phenomena. Like, for example, something like that is not good. If you don't have the noetic consciousness that goes with the recollection, you might think that you're in some, simulation, or that, somebody is an imposter or something along those lines. And similarly, when you have low recollection, but familiarity is high, you don't have recollection to constrain why something feels familiar, you can get other sorts of bizarre phenomena like deja vu, or feeling. Here's the interesting one. You can get feelings of insight in that situation, even when you're not actually having a veridical insight. And this is sort of, one of the things I've mentioned with psychedelics is that if they do impair this recollection process, enhance familiarity, this might be where this noetic quality comes from. And people are now going to feel like there's an insight that they're having, even when there's none to be had. And I think that, this is why we have to be a little cautious about interpreting what we think is insight. And also what's interesting is people can now misattribute feelings of familiarity to, for example, memories that didn't exist. And that can result in a false memory. I think similarly, people can misattribute feelings of insight or feelings of familiarity that give you this feeling of insight onto ideas that probably aren't actually that good, or scrambled ideas of some sort. And this can result in, I had this crazy insight, I just can't bring it back to reality. And it's like, I don't believe you. Yeah.
I think deja vu is a great example of how familiarity and recollection can be decoupled, and one that, many people will have experienced directly. I mean, deja vu is familiarity in the absence of recollection. That's actually experientially what we mean by that. And I think the majority of people have had deja vu, at least to some extent, at least at some point. So we all have firsthand experience with that.
There's also jamais vu, which is essentially the opposite. It's recollection in the absence of it. And I think the example people will always use, if you say a word enough times and then you're like, wait a minute, is that actually a word, or is that how that is said? And I think that can be, sometimes you can get this weird brain fart where you're like, wait a minute, the familiarity doesn't map onto this anymore, but the recollection is there and something feels odd about it. And then there's presque vu, which is essentially the feeling of insight when you're not actually having one. So it's interesting that all these French sayings have come up for these distinctions between recollection and familiarity, and presumably independently of these distinctions of recollection and familiarity. But some people have actually gone out and tried to study them in the absence of drugs, like Lynn Reeder not Lynn Reeder, sorry. I can't believe I'm forgetting her name, but I will remember it eventually. And she,
who it is, but you can't recollect it in the moment.
Exactly. Yeah. Have the familiarity. If you gave me the name, I would know it, but I can't recollect her name off of the papers that I've been reading.
Yeah. In any case, one more thing that I think we should unpack up front here too, you sort of hinted at it, when you mention things like false memories, is the sort of pliability of memories themselves. And so to what extent, so if you learn something and then you remember it, you store it in your memory for the long term, that memory has been consolidated. And then every time that you recall that memory, you're retrieving the memory from its storage in your brain. And, my understanding is that every time you do that, there's actually like a reconsolidation. So every time you recall something, there's actually room for that memory to be tweaked a little bit. And in fact, this may even happen quite a lot. Is that true? And can you talk a little bit about how pliable memories are after they're initially consolidated?
Yeah, definitely. So again, this is going to be very dependent on your, somewhat dependent anyways, on your definition of consolidation, whether or not something has been, semanticized to the cortex, or whether or not you're talking about just, recently encoded information that still hasn't quite stabilized yet at a synaptic level. But I think in either way, you get this, as soon as you retrieve the memory, you're allowing for the possibility of strengthening it, weakening it, or distorting it. And I mean, that was a lot of my work where in grad school, actually, I had a whole separate area I could have written a whole other dissertation on that had nothing to do with drugs, about how we can distort people's memories through different routes of processing information. And so you can give people a bunch of perceptually related things. I can show you I can show you pictures of a scrambled stimuli of like limes and oranges and grapefruits, and later on ask you, did you see a picture of a lemon? And you might say yes. I can just show you the words lime, orange, and grapefruit. And because those words are going to be processed and feel quite familiar, you can now misattribute that to, let's say, a mental image of a lemon. And you'll say, yeah, I saw a picture of a lemon, even though you never actually did. And so, yeah, I think there's ways in which essentially, after you encode information that you're now opening them up, they're now susceptible to distortions. And every time you retrieve information that, it can, so for example, if I see you at a conference and then I say, oh yeah, you were wearing a green shirt during this podcast. You're like, yeah, I was wearing a green shirt. Maybe if you typically wear green shirts, that's going to seem something plausible. Now, forever in your memory, you're going to remember that we did this podcast with a green shirt. Turns out you're wearing a gray shirt. That's like an easy way in which your memory could probably be manipulated. But yeah, I think there are, for example, more semanticized types of memories. Let's say these ones that might be consolidated at a systems level, whether or not you believe in systems consolidation or not, but they can become almost factual. It'd be very hard to kind of disrupt those types of memories. So it's, you can do a lot of brain damage to me, and it's going to be a while before I forget that George Washington was the first president of the country. It's kind of like patients with Alzheimer's. They'll lose the ability to form new memories. They'll lose the ability to remember recently encoded information, like the doctor that they've now met several times over. But, their mother's face, it takes a minute before that goes away. Not to say that doesn't, but at least the person that's most prominent in their life, who they've probably semanticized their face to some degree, that takes a minute. And then of course, when that happens, it's a really, scary and terrible situation, but, they'll probably lose some other types of factual information rather than the like really hard coded ones. And I think that those are the types of memories, though, ironically, sometimes that we do want to manipulate during treatment with things like psychedelics, given that, our sense of self can become very hard coded, for example, and I'm a terrible person because I did these things and every day is the same. And, there's nothing worth living for, et cetera. That can become a very kind of a normal way of living. Or, with PTSD, people talk about how those traumatic memories really just take on a life of their own, and that becomes who you are. And so we do want to disrupt those types of memories. And in rodents, you can show that. You can take these memories that are no longer reliant on the amygdala or the hippocampus, and you can do certain things. You reactivate the memory, and now it places it in a state that's labile. You inject a protein synthesis inhibitor into the amygdala or hippocampus, because now they supposedly become reliant on the hippocampus or amygdala again. And then it's not immediately, they don't go away, but the next day when they reconsolidate, they have some time to destabilize with that protein synthesis inhibitor. You can now delete those fear memories that are, that were really hard coded into the cortex. In humans, it's been a lot more difficult to do. And this is, kind of one of the interesting sort of sides to this idea of looking at recollection familiarity. If psychedelics really do enhance the coding in the cortex, you might imagine that learning information through an enhanced route in the cortex might be better able to disrupt or overwrite some of those hard-coded memories, those semanticized memories in the cortex. But this is definitely somewhat speculation.
Well, I mean, this sort of gets in an anchor point here for people who are familiar with the podcast and this work generally. The work of, MDMA assisted psychotherapy, if you think about it, what you're really doing in those clinical trials is you are having multiple therapy sessions, and then you're introducing the MDMA. In other words, you're getting the person to talk about their trauma, to recollect their trauma and call up those memories. And the idea would be that every time you're retrieving those memories, the synapses and the circuits storing them are in a labile state, which means, they can potentially change. And the MDMA would seem to be somehow taking advantage of that. So when you introduce the MDMA while they're in this state of recollecting their past trauma, the plasticity or the potential of the memory to be changed allows them to actually decouple the traumatic sort of emotionally salient part of it from the recollection of the episode itself. And that does seem to be what they say afterwards, right? When this therapy works, as it often does, people aren't forgetting what happened to them. It just doesn't carry the same kind of emotional weight that it used to. So somehow the sort of facts of what happened to them are becoming decoupled from the emotional salience that used to be associated with those facts.
Yeah. And I think that there's other aspects to this. Like one is that, I was saying that in humans, it's been rather difficult to really show reconsolidation. I mean, it's kind of been there, but a lot more difficult, at least compared to rodents. But what you can think about is that, well, one reason is that there's a couple of reasons. One is that it might be difficult to trigger that reconsolidation process such that the memory becomes labile, but we have this drug that supposedly induces plasticity or metaplasticity or whatever you want to call it. I think, some people, there's been some argument now between David Olson and Gould Dolan about what kind of plasticity is important. And it might increase the ability to labelize, to make the memory more plastic.
Yeah.
And so the other thing is that sometimes you really need a really hard retrieval to like make a memory labile. And so it's like, so people have shown, for example, a weak sort of retrieval or a retrieval that doesn't have good prediction error doesn't end up being very useful in triggering the reconsolidation process. But at least with something like psychedelics, maybe these two things are directly linked, that plasticity inducing mechanism, as well as they enhance your mental imagery. And so I'm not going to say that the retrieval of whatever you're retrieving is more veridical, it's more true, but at least it could feel more true and really kind of trigger that. As well as one more thing that I've thought about is that, I've wondered, you can take a rodent that has had a very impoverished sort of life. It lives in a cage in a white, sterile environment. And when you play at a cue that is now associated with, a shock, that is the first time it's heard any sort of, sound like that. And it's going to be very easy to delete that one memory, right? But as humans, we're hyper-associative, and anything that's, kind of scary. In fact, one of the issues with PTSD is that there's an overgeneralization where maybe the sand from the desert, I've used this example all the time, the sand from the desert because you fought a war in Iraq, that's going to now be associated with trauma. But now you go to the beach, the sand is there, and now you're overgeneralizing, you're going to have like a full-blown episode because now you're at the beach. And I wonder if you were to take, let's say, a New York subway rat, rather than, one that's been raised in an impoverished environment, that New York subway rat has heard all kinds of beeps and tones from the New York subway, from people's cell phones, whatever. And I would wonder if you try to delete the memory the way that people have done this in these reconsolidation paradigms, if that hyper association that the brain is known to do would actually fill in the gaps, and you're not actually going to be able to delete it very well unless you delete all the associations that comes with that tone that's now associated with a traumatic shock. And I think one thing that, psychedelics have kind of been shown to do is, at least one study showed this, is that you can get enhanced kind of semantic priming or enhanced semantic spread. And so not only are you, making certain memories labile, it's perhaps making a lot of other things labile that are related to those. And so if we can not just rewrite the like single trauma, but all the associations with that trauma, I think that could also be useful. And of course, there's, certain hard-coded things you wouldn't ever want rewritten. And I think the example I've used is that when you see a chunk of metal, you shouldn't think of it as a chunk of metal. You should know that that's a car. That automatic mapping between the percept to the concept should never be broken, or else you're going to find yourself walking the street with chunks of metal and then find yourself hit, right? Or the mapping between what is red and green. You don't ever want those two things to mix up, or else again, you're going to run a red light, And people do sort of talk about sometimes after psychedelics that these really hard-coded things can become a little plastic in people, for example, HPPD, they might get forever color constancy. So that's kind of now a hard coded thing that might become kind of broken down. It's a semanticized, sort of way in which, in the cortex that probably is hard to break, but if it does get broken, really bad things can happen. And I think this is where we have to be really careful of what we're overwriting in the cortex, assuming these drugs really do enhance information processing, psychedelics specifically, in the cortex.
So in starting to think about how different kinds of drugs affect memory at different phases or different kinds of memory, let's talk a little bit about what distinct classes of drugs are. Like, what is a class of drugs? What makes something a sedative versus a dissociative at the level of the chemistry and the pharmacology? How do you start to think about that in the abstract?
Yeah. So this is something that I've, it's not totally arbitrary how I've parsed things. Other people have kind of made similar sorts of taxonomies for drugs. But yeah, I've sort of classified drugs that alter the GABA A receptor as sedatives. I know that, other drugs can be sedating. THC can be sedating. I know that opioids can be sedating, but just for the sake of simplicity, I've started referring to sedatives as anything that modulates the GABA A receptor. So the GABA is your main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. And so, for example, when you're having a seizure, they might give you something like something that modulates the GABA A receptor to kind of mellow out the activity. Alcohol has many different effects, but probably its main effect comes from modulation of the GABA A receptor. You also have a GABA B receptor, and there are some drugs that modulate the GABA B receptor, such as GHB. GHB also seems to modulate the GHB receptor. And so it seems to have this weird biphasic effect where you get this initial almost MDMA-like effect at lower doses. And then I think it becomes really sedating at higher doses when it hits the GABA B receptor. And you do have other drugs like phenibut and some other ones that modulate the GABA B receptor. And clearly they have a slightly different effect. I think GABA A is probably more sedating, but I'll eat my words when somebody shows me some good GABA B data. But other drugs that modulate the GABA A receptor, and all these drugs do kind of share some effects. So you've got alcohol, you've got benzodiazepines like Xanax, alprazolam, any of these other triazolam, et cetera. Triazolam is also sometimes used as an anesthesia. And you have Ambien, so zolpidem. This is, these are drugs used for sleep aids. And so all these drugs, interestingly enough, you take a lot of them, you become addicted. They're the only drugs that'll kill you if you go off of them immediately because you can get seizures. So you keep inhibiting the system over and over and over, then you get a rebound effect if you go off of them. Opioids, you'll feel like hell after going off of them, but it won't kill you necessarily. Stimulants, you will feel depressed and lack of energy, but it won't kill you if you go off of them. I think these are the GABA A drugs. And actually with alcohol, when people are withdrawing, they give them benzodiazepines. And then you take benzodiazepines, low doses over time, and hopefully try to come off of them eventually.
So at a high level, basically what you're saying is what allows you to classify certain drugs as being one type of drug, like a sedative, is that they have at least directionally the same qualitative effects, and those are due to some sort of shared underlying mechanism that they modulate a receptor in the same general direction. So they may not have identical effects, but if you're increasing GABA transmission through the GABA A receptor, and this is resulting in lethargy and sleepiness and that general kind of psychological effect, then you would say, okay, that drug is a sedative.
Yeah. And, there's other interesting things that these drugs uniquely do that I guess we can get into in a bit. But I think these drugs do kind of group together nicely. And as you said, it's obviously not the case that they do the exact same thing. People like their benzos more than they like their alcohol. And it's not just because the hangover that you get with alcohol that you don't get so much with benzos. Ambien, it clearly has this borderline hallucinogenic effect. And then what I should say is all these drugs modulate the GABA A receptor, those three drugs, and they might modulate different types of GABA A receptors that have different subunits, but they all modulate them by binding to kind of similar locations on the GABA A receptor and facilitating your endogenous GABA. So the natural inhibitory transmitter that you have in your brain now acts even better if something like a benzo or alcohol or Ambien is now bound to the receptor. There's also barbiturates, and those also modulate the receptor. I'm forgetting what the exact difference between those and benzos are, but it could be that I think benzos increase the probability of opening sodium channels or something. And then I think that barbiturates just kind of hold the sodium channel open, but don't quote me on that. And then you have drugs like, these have yet to enter the psychedelic renaissance. But I did speak to, I don't know if I should say his name for fear of, I don't know if he wants us out there in the open, but I was at this conference this past weekend in Toronto from Research to Reality. And I spoke to somebody, this pharma company, and they're potentially going to be looking into to muscimol. Muscimol is a drug that exists in the Mario mushroom, the Alice in Wonderland mushroom, the fly agaric, Amanita muscaria, the red mushroom with white dots on it. That is not the same type of magic mushroom as what's in, psilocybin containing mushrooms. It contains muscimol, and this actually agonizes the GABA A receptor. It activates it in the same way your endogenous GABA might. It binds to the same location. It doesn't modulate the receptor. And that one is especially thought to cause certain types of hallucinations and dissociations. And so I've referred to those types of drugs as being a dissociative sedative. And there's also gaboxidol. That was a drug that was attempted to be marketed as a sleep aid, but then it ended up, I think maybe because of the hallucinations that people got from it, it wasn't as good as Ambien and didn't make it forward. Although I think maybe some would argue it's a better sleep aid, and I don't know. But so those drugs are also somewhat sedating, but they clearly have another side to them that's borderline hallucinogenic, as does Ambien for whatever reason, even though it's not an agonist. So yeah, qualitative differences, but they do overall share many features, and their main effects can be attributed to the GABA A receptor, but how they activate that GABA A receptor is probably playing a role in some of the differences in their effects, as well as some of the things they're doing outside of the GABA A receptor, like alcohol, which is a pretty pharmacologically promiscuous drug.
Yeah. So there's many sedatives. They all directionally have the same effect. They basically make you sleepy, some of them more than others. Some of them also have some kind of dissociative and or hallucinatory and or some other component to them. So they're not all identical, but they're all acting on this one receptor. They might also act on other receptors, but they're positively modulating this GABA A inhibitory receptor. So that's why we cluster them all together. So now compare that to something like dissociative. So why would something like ketamine be classified as a dissociative and not a sedative?
Right. Yeah. So now moving on to dissociatives, we can basically move through my paper of unique effects in that order, because I think that the drugs we group them that way on purpose because I think they tell kind of this building story. So yeah, the NMDA antagonists these are drugs that they modulate the NMDA receptor. So the NMDA receptor is very much involved in, we talked about long-term potentiation, strengthening of synapses. That's a receptor in the brain that's very much involved in that. And glutamate is kind of one of the endogenous ligands for NMDA, as well as NMDA itself, which is a chemical that binds to the NMDA receptor. And when you bind certain drugs to it, that when you block that receptor, you get these pretty crazy, effects, like with ketamine. You get these very dissociative effects. Ketamine is certainly also a promiscuous drug that binds to various other things. I think, the R enantiomer of ketamine, so you've got the left-handed and right-handed one. The S-ketamine has now been, approved for depression, but the R, for example, I think binds to like sigma receptors. I think the S enantiomer, S-ketamine, binds also to opioid receptors, but you can say most of its effects probably come from this NMDA blockade. And one way you can say that is because drugs like dextromethorphan, which also are pharmacologically promiscuous, but it seems to also do very, similar things, dissociative things by binding to the NMDA receptor. Dextromethorphan is in various over-the-counter cough syrups. Nitrous oxide, an NMDA antagonist, similar sorts of dissociation. I think that, some people will kind of talk about the really crazy nitrous oxide effects you get, but that's because you're just getting such a high dose. If you were to K-hole, I'm sure that the effects could be somewhat similar. I'm trying to think of there was another NMDA. You have the other ones like MXC, methoxetamine or something, and some of these other drugs that have kind of come about over the years. But those are your NMDA antagonists. They bind to the NMDA. Yeah, they block the NMDA receptor. And they also cause, somewhat they can be somewhat sedating, especially at their higher doses, but they pretty much all share somewhat hallucinogenic properties. And they're definitely somewhat different from what you get with the GABA A positive allosteric modulators or any GABA A sort of drug. I'm trying to think of what other they do produce some, this dense amnesic state. So with, I think, the GABA A drugs, you get like a blackout. With the NMDA drugs, you get a like K-hole, but I don't think anybody would say those two things are necessarily the same, right? And so again, you have a shared pharmacology across these drugs, and then certain shared qualitative aspects to them that then I think makes me call them dissociatives, and these other drugs sedatives. So yeah, then there's, should we go over more about the dissociatives, or should we?
No, I mean, I think, yeah. I think this is starting to become clear to people, right? So sedatives and dissociatives, basically the difference is the things that we call sedatives interact with one receptor, the GABA A receptor, in a particular kind of way, in a certain kind of direction to give you a certain kind of effect. So, I don't know what a good analogy is here. Maybe like a guitar chord or something. Like there's many different E chords you can play. They'll all have somewhat different notes, but they share like a common structure. And so the sedatives are all acting through this GABA A receptor in some way. And that's distinct from the dissociatives, which are interacting with a different receptor in a different kind of way. And that accounts, at least in part or in large part, for the differences in the qualitative effects they have.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that's worth mentioning, because this will this again will tell you something unique about psychedelics once we get to that point, is that many of these drugs they really facilitate inhibition. So GABA A, you're driving the GABA A receptor activity at it. They're increasing the ability for GABA to do its job. Therefore, you're facilitating inhibition. Glutamate is the main excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. And now you're blocking glutamate with dissociatives from doing its job. So in some ways you're you're causing more inhibition. Now there are some weird downstream effects from NMDA antagonism that can result in more glutamate release and whatnot. But just at a very a basic level, at the initial step, you are talking about blocking a excitatory neurotransmitter from doing its job.
I think you're basically explaining why sedatives and dissociatives are kind of, you might consider them close cousins.
And why they both impair the encoding of new memories, for example. And so that's one idea. And then if we go through my unique, effects paper, the really long title, because I had to include all the different drugs in there, drug classes, you have your psychedelics. And so these are also hallucinogenic, right? Like the NMDA antagonists or even some GABA A drugs. But they activate the serotonin 2A receptor. So serotonin's interesting compared to some of your other neurotransmitter systems. There's like 14 different receptors. And as far as I know, that's more receptors for a given system that a single neurotransmitter can bind to compared to, I think, dopamine. Maybe there's 5 receptors. GABA, there's GABA A and B. I'm sure some pharmacologists are going to come on here and correct me. But there seems to be a lot of receptors for serotonin. And what some will say is that the serotonin 2A receptor has low affinity for serotonin itself. Not that serotonin doesn't bind it, but maybe serotonin will bind it when there's more serotonin kind of floating around in the system, because now it's higher probability that it'll hit that receptor. Although I think there's low affinity and high affinity states of the serotonin 2A receptor to, complicate things. But the point is that when you activate that receptor, you then get kind of your classic psychedelic effects. And this is what I refer to as psychedelics, or drugs that bind to this specific receptor, because they do share somewhat, the types of visuals that you might get. They share maybe some of the weird thought loops you might go through. They share the same auditory distortions, the color constancy breaking down. I guess for those who don't know, you see a white wall with shadows on it. You see it all as white. It's good that you see it as all white because it's all one solid, it's all one solid material. But if you would actually take individual pixels out of that white wall, blow them up onto a white background on a computer screen, you would notice that there's actually probably all kinds of different colors in there: yellows, reds, greens, etc. And it's, under psychedelics that might break down something like color constancy. I'm sure you also see various colors that aren't actually there on psychedelics, but a lot of times I think color constancy is maybe that first step of breaking down color perception. And in some ways you are seeing what's actually there. It's just not very useful to be adaptive. It wouldn't be good if I thought this wall was made of many different materials, and that's why it's shining different colors. But yeah, with psychedelics, so you have drugs like LSD, psilocybin, DMT. I think I'm now told that 5-MeO DMT actually has relatively low affinity for the serotonin 2A receptor, but time will tell. If you block that receptor, do you remove its effects? And that's at least what a lot of people have shown now with regular DMT and with psilocybin and with LSD. If you block those receptors and you take LSD, you're pretty much removing most of the psychedelic experience. And so even MDMA. So in this paper that, I've got as a preprint, we group MDMA in with psychedelics. And the reason we do this is there's a couple. MDMA is really a stimulant, or maybe I should say entactogen stimulant psychedelic hybrid, in the order with which it might be considered. The entactogenic effects are coming from the fact that it's preventing.
What is that? Explain entactogen.
There's not a great, it means like touched within. It's not a great,
but it's the empathy, touchy-feely component.
Yes. Yeah. I avoid the term empathy because, it's interesting, right? There's this terrible distinction, if you ask me, and I'm not a social psychologist, so maybe I shouldn't, critique their field too much, but there's this distinction between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. And they'll say, hey, here's a bunch of pictures of faces that are morphed between neutral and sad, neutral and happy, whatever. Tell me, it's like 10% happy, 30% happy, 50% happy, et cetera. Tell me what emotion is in this face. And a lot of people will become worse on that task under MDMA. So let's say my threshold for detecting a happy face is, let's not say happy, because I think the happy one actually either gets better or stays the same with MDMA, but like fear. Let's say my threshold normally to detect fear would be like 30% it needs to be 30% fearful. And then, the 70% neutral. You can morph these faces, with different percentages, right? But then when I'm on MDMA, I need a 50% fearful face to detect that it's fearful. Well, if I can't detect what's going on in that face, how do I know what they're feeling? And so cognitive empathy is this ability of detecting, what's in a face. It's usually has an objective answer.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, I can even see that tying into why it has these pro-social. So when people hear the word entactogen, it's sort of speaking to the pro-social side of drugs like MDMA. And right, if you can't tell that someone is looking angry or unapproachable, you'll be more likely to approach them. And, one of the hallmarks of MDMA is, people are very approachable.
Right. Yeah. And so I think the pro-sociality is a good one. I think the empathy, sometimes I'm like, wait a minute. And so there's this idea of emotional empathy that the MDMA increases. You look at somebody, an emotional face, and you're like, oh, I can feel what they're feeling. Right. But if you don't actually know what they're going, if you don't know objectively what they are, you think, oh yeah, this person is surprised. I'm surprised too. It's like, no, they're fearful. It's like, that doesn't really count as empathy to me. You wouldn't say that somebody is empathic who feels the emotions of others, but doesn't get the emotion correct. That would be, yeah. And so I think that, it's unclear to me if the empathogen is not a great, I think, term for these drugs. But yeah, I think that, the pro-sociality, and I think that this is something Harriet DeWitt has done a lot of, where she has, kind of defined what's the distinction on the social effects between MDMA and other types of stimulants like methamphetamine, right? MDMA is methylene dioxide methamphetamine. And I mean, I think it's still sometimes unclear to me what the distinction is, because clearly other stimulants make people social, but I don't know if they do so. It's kind of almost like confidence versus arrogance, I feel like, is maybe, the way that somebody might be social. And I mean, both drugs make people more talkative. They make people approach people more. Certainly less people are getting into fights on MDMA, more people are getting into fights under stimulants. So maybe there's an aggression side to it. There's also, it makes you wonder, so here's the other side of MDMA. It does affect dopamine and norepinephrine. And this is what a stimulant is so serotonin, the way it affects all these chemicals, MDMA, is that it binds to the transporter that would normally shuttle synaptic serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. There's one for each of those: serotonin transporter, dopamine transporter, norepinephrine transporters. That's SERT, DAT, and NET. And so it'll bind to those transporters and not only prevent those transporters from doing their job, shuttling serotonin back into the presynaptic neuron, but they also take that transporter back up into the presynaptic neuron and then cause a release of a bunch of serotonin or dopamine or norepinephrine. And so, one difference between, for example, methylphenidate and amphetamine is that methylphenidate doesn't do that reversal of the transporter. It just blocks the transporter. It doesn't release a bunch of extra dopamine and norepinephrine. And so anyways, MDMA does that. It's unclear now if those stimulant effects are also needed, which come from the dopamine and noradrenergic effects or norepinephrine effects. And so, it's the other side of MDMA. It's definitely a stimulant, and anybody who, doesn't want to call it a stimulant is just, playing themselves. It certainly has very strong stimulant effects. And there are drugs that have been developed that more selectively modulate this, like synaptic serotonin. There's drugs like it's methylene dioxyaminoindane. I think a lot of these were developed by Dave Nichols. So yeah, MDAI, there's MEAI. There was a drink called Pace that was sold in Canada that contained MEAI. Eventually the Canadian government took it off, but I think for a bit it was being sold. I know David Nutt in the UK at one point wanted to create a drug based on something like this that was it modulated the serotonin transporter in this fashion, but didn't affect dopamine and norepinephrine, to try to create a new drug that people can do on the weekends that might not be as neurotoxic as something like MDMA, and maybe doesn't have the stimulant effects that could keep people up all night, et cetera. I think he abandoned that project, but you can find old interviews of him talking about it. And by old, I mean like 7 years ago, 5 years ago, something like that. And so, yeah, anyway, so MDMA, but the last thing that MDMA does is MDMA is actually two drugs. Like the way we're talking about ketamine, you have a left-handed version and a right-handed version. All the same chemicals, they're just organized in a fashion, just like my hands have, my left and right hand have all the same material. Let's pretend they do anyways, except they're organized in a fashion that directly mirror each other. And you can do that with chemicals. And so the R enantiomer, recto of MDMA, actually binds to the serotonin 2A receptor. And people have shown if you block the serotonin 2A receptor, like you do with something like psychedelic drugs like LSD, psilocybin, classic psychedelics, or more full psychedelics, maybe we should call them, you do remove some of the effects of MDMA. And if you take a drug like MDA, so that's methylene-doxyamphetamine, not methamphetamine, you get a bit more of the psychedelic effects. It's probably still much more on the MDMA side than the LSD side or psilocybin side, but it certainly has a little bit more of that psychedelic flavor. I've heard even if you take 200 milligrams, you're not, 200 milligrams of MDMA might be, I don't think I recommend anybody do that. I think you could in theory, some people could die from it.
That's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that there was actually somebody who died from a pure 250 at a festival in the UK. I remember reading. So, but in theory, if you take a high dose of MDMA, you might still want to be social, even though you're going to be kind of stoned to a chair. I've heard on MDA, it can get kind of weird where it becomes almost like psychedelics where I'm socially awkward. I'd rather be laying in a bed, with one or two friends or something. Right. And so, then you have drugs like 2CB, which I think it does actually bind to the serotonin transporter and you get some of this entactogenic effects, but it also binds to the serotonin 2A receptor and is certainly more of the LSD psilocybin type drug than it is MDMA. And so I think a lot of these drugs do have these kind of in-between qualities. And, I think MDMA is just a hybrid that certainly is more entactogenic stimulant than it is psychedelic, but it has some psychedelic effects that I think we can't totally ignore. But time will tell. Once we give a drug that, if we can give a serotonin 2A antagonist during an MDMA session to show that, hey, it has all the, good effects that we need, then we can say that, hey, those are the most therapeutic effects. We don't need the psychedelic effect. But at least a lot of the animal research is showing that you do need the serotonin 2A effects to get at least some of the animal models of treatment of fear memories and whatnot. And then, okay, this now brings me to stimulants, which I can briefly go over because stimulants, basically, because I've already sort of explained them. They mess with the dopamine and norepinephrine transporter. And so these are drugs that, like amphetamine, methamphetamine, but methylphenidate, as I mentioned, and cocaine actually don't reverse the transporter's action. They don't release dopamine and norepinephrine. They just block it. But it's interesting because if you just block these transporters, you don't quite get the same type of stimulant effect a lot of times. There's drugs like reboxetine, which is a serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. Also, if you just block the serotonin transporter with something like Prozac, or citalopram, you don't get MDMA-like effects. And same thing here. So it's interesting. I don't know what methylphenidate clearly still and cocaine still clearly have something they share with amphetamine and methamphetamine, but it must not have to do with just releasing, it's not releasing serotonin and dopamine. That's strictly it. But those things do apparently add to the stimulant effect. And I realized that caffeine could also be a stimulant. Here, I mean, just these dopaminergic, noradrenergic effects is what I refer to as a stimulant. They keep people up. They can enhance focus, although there's probably an inverted U, et cetera. I don't think we have to talk too much more about stimulants unless,
So to summarize so far, basically, we've talked about sedatives, dissociatives, stimulants, psychedelics. Sedatives are drugs that make you sleepy, and they do this at least in part by cranking up inhibition through this GABA A receptor. Dissociatives have this very interesting dissociative, weird type of effect that people report, and they block a different receptor called the NMDA receptor. Stimulants are the ones that most of us are familiar with to some extent. They stimulate you, they activate you and make you more awake, basically, and they're acting primarily through dopamine and norepinephrine based mechanisms. And then you said that the psychedelics have their effects, the true psychedelics or the strong psychedelics, by activating the serotonin 2A receptor. So each class of drugs is characterized by interacting with a different set or different type of receptor to give rise to different effects. One that we haven't talked about yet are cannabinoids. So how do they differ?
Okay. So then you have your endocannabinoid system. this is kind of interesting because I think they found the receptors before they found the endogenous neurotransmitter essentially. And so there's this idea that, oh my God, were we just meant to all smoke weed? What's this receptor doing in there if there's not a chemical in there? I don't think any scientist was actually thinking that, but I'm sure the public, I'm sure the scientists were like, there's definitely an endogenous a chemical that binds to these receptors. We just haven't found it yet. And so I think that the receptors, like there's CB1 and CB2, one or both of those receptors, cannabinoid receptor 1, cannabinoid receptor 2, they were found in like the 60s or something. And then it was not until the 90s that they found one of the endogenous ligands, which they named anandamide. So ananda means bliss in Sanskrit. And so this was kind of they named it because of, THC, but really, obviously, this thing came first in terms of evolutionarily binding to things. It's not like people are using THC and then we developed these receptors or whatever it is. Or then we developed anandamide, we created an endogenous version because of evolutionary use of cannabis or anything like that. So it was just developed later. And so they named it anandamide. And so, you have endogenous anandamide that binds to these receptors. What's interesting about most of these cannabinoid receptors, well, CB1, I think, is more densely distributed in the brain, whereas I think CB2 is more around the body, like your gut and whatnot. And, again, I'm not a neurobiologist. I would be happy if, some pharmacologist corrected me on that. But your CB1 receptors generally tend to be presynaptic. So you have one neuron that's projecting onto another neuron, and every receptor we pretty much talked about, generally speaking, is on the second neuron that is having another neuron, impose onto it. And so, CB1 receptors tend to be more presynaptic. So they're in that first neuron that's shooting out to the second one. And they're essentially, dopamine and norepinephrine can generally be activating I think a lot of things, the first two drugs we talked about, NMDA antagonism, you're sort of inhibiting the ability for the main excitatory neurotransmitter to do its job. GABA is inhibiting, is enhancing the inhibition of the brain. This is CB1 receptors are also inhibitory. I think they prevent the presynaptic neuron from firing onto that next neuron. So again, generally inhibitory. I did find out recently there's one set of excitatory CB1 receptors in this region, in the entorhinal cortex. And then I heard from another, set of people that might be bullshit. And so anyways, I think
it gets a little bit tricky. So the cannabinoid receptor results in inhibition of a neuron, but there's a lot of CB1 receptors on inhibitory neurons. So if you inhibit an inhibitory neuron, it leads to excitation.
Two negatives equal a positive. Exactly. And here's the thing. So I didn't talk about serotonin and so dopamine, norepinephrine generally are excitatory, but there are, for example, they're autoreceptors essentially in certain areas where if you activate those receptors, you can actually decrease dopaminergic tone and you can maybe cause more inhibition. But, just broadly speaking, I think dopamine and norepinephrine, I think, are more kind of excitatory, and, GABA and NMDA tags are more inhibitory. And then cannabinoid receptors are generally inhibitory in many ways. But serotonin's a weird one. You have things like 5-HT1A. So you have 14 receptors. You have the 1A receptor, and that's actually, I think, inhibitory. You have the serotonin 2A receptor, which is generally excitatory. But again, there are serotonin 2A receptors on inhibitory neurons also in entorhinal cortex, probably an interesting structure. It's the entrance to the hippocampus, by the way. So it's some people refer to it as a wall of inhibition, lots of inhibitory circuitry that prevents all information from getting into the hippocampus, or else you get catastrophic interference and then you wouldn't be able to remember anything. But the general consensus is that you get probably more excitation from activating the serotonin 2A receptor, which is excitatory and located mostly on, as some people say anyways, on layer 5 pyramidal neurons throughout the cortex, which those are projectors that tend to be excitatory. So, so I guess, this now kind of brings me to what's interesting about some of these drugs is in terms of, if we talk about these drugs and their effects on, let's just start with memory and coding. You have all these drugs that inhibit the system. Surprise, surprise. They they make your encoding worse. And again, I don't want to say retrieval. I'm not going to talk about consolidation. I'm talking about the formation of memories. So I give you a drug, I show you a bunch of stimuli. I'm now going to test your memory 2 days later. So, all the acute effects are gone. Let's pretend the consolidation stuff doesn't exist for now. And so forming those memories under these drugs, another way, by the way, you can test consolidation is you can test people immediately, you can test them later. And if the effect is larger later, you can say that, okay, it was probably affecting somewhat the consolidation as well. But anyway, that's a whole other. So yeah, you have drugs that inhibit. So GABA A positive allosteric modulators, and NMDA antagonists and cannabinoids, they impair your ability to form recollection and familiarity-based memories. So if I test your memory the next day, you're not gonna be able to recollect as well things. You're not gonna be able to make the associations and where and when information. If I just show you, hey, did you see this? Did you drink this beer last night? This is not a beer, by the way. This is some weird probiotic drink my partner got. But if I show you this, did you drink this last night? You'll be like, I don't know, it doesn't feel familiar, And so all these drugs generally impact both those types of memories. And what's interesting, at least one of the things, we found was, generally speaking, impairing familiarity was more difficult. At higher doses, you get impairments of familiarity of some of these drugs. And I think that makes sense. A lot of times, you can't recollect things, but someone's like, hey, but do you remember you got up on the bar and you did some stupid things last night. You danced up there. And it's like, oh yeah, I did do that. You might recognize that. Then there's also situations in which you just saturate all the receptors throughout your brain. Probably you're blacking out and you're now like, I have no recollection. That doesn't even feel familiar to me. Nothing. Right. And so I think that, one thing that this tells us about familiarity is that it's a distributed sort of process, that it takes, perceptual, semantic information, and it's the activation across all these things. And that's why it's kind of a backup process almost that is probably developed for when recollection fails. Your hippocampus is susceptible to all kinds of problems. So Korsakoff syndrome, that's when you drink too much, that your hippocampus gets massively messed up. Herpes encephalitis. So I think somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think even type 1 herpes, the one that 80% of people or whatever have, the cold sores on your lips, I think in like some rare proportion of people that can infect your brain, your hippocampus goes away. Obviously epilepsy, then you have to take out your hippocampus, or parts of your hippocampus. A lot of times the medial temporal lobe, but hippocampus gets hit pretty hard. So you have this backup process familiarity that seems to be generally pretty good at giving you at least some ability to recognize things. So if I take out your hippocampus and I show you a list of words, and then I ask you, hey, recall as many words as you can, you might say to me, what list of words? And then instead I'll be like, here's a list of words that I'm going to show you that you've previously seen and some that you haven't previously seen. Tell me which ones you've seen. And you might be like, okay. And then you're like, that feels familiar. You'll still be able to perform above chance because you can use familiarity, this backup process. So again, all of these drugs, so cannabinoids, NMDA antagonists, THC, dissociatives like ketamine, and GABA A positive allosteric modulators like benzos, alcohol, and sulfidum, they all drive sort of inhibition, and they impair recollection at higher doses, impair familiarity. The one last thing I want to say about that is, in our review, we had one zolpidem manipulation, so Ambien. And it was a weird sort of study, and there might be reasons for this that are just explained by the differences in the study design. Interestingly enough, that study, I think this is the only manipulation in which familiarity was hit harder than recollection. And so, it's like, this would be something very interesting to study in the future. It's like, wait a minute, is this an actual difference between this type of sedative and some of these other sedatives? Does it really produce, produce almost like what you might think of as, like a Capgras syndrome, where, what you finally can recollect might still not feel familiar, even though you might be able to bring that information in mind. You might be like, that still doesn't feel familiar though. Basically autonoetic consciousness is higher than noetic consciousness, when usually it's the other way around. So it sounds like basically at a high level, you're basically just saying sedatives, dissociatives, and psychedelics, drugs that not psychedelics, cannabinoids.
And cannabinoids. Yeah. I'm sorry. Sedatives, dissociatives, and cannabinoids tend to disrupt memory encoding. So if you give one of these drugs to someone while they're learning something, they will perform worse when you ask them to remember what they did later.
Yes. And they impair both this recollection, hippocampally dependent form of memory. And maybe I didn't quite specify this, but like semantic memory, which is kind of a distributed cortical representation, familiarity seems to rely on the activation of the cortex, both kind of perceptual and semantic nodes throughout the brain. It's kind of like the fluency with which you process that information. And so actually what's an interesting aspect of familiarity is that Better retrieval of a familiarity-based memory actually involves less activation. So it's almost like it takes less processing, and therefore now you get familiarity. So if I show you an image and then show you that image again, less activation in something like perirhinal cortex or visual cortices would actually be associated with a higher feeling of familiarity. Whereas recollection, it involves kind of like the reactivation of all the different, involves the hippocampus, as well as the reactivation of many different cortices to try to recapitulate that information and relive what you kind of perceived.
What about, so it's probably pretty intuitive to people that, if you take ketamine or you drink alcohol while you're trying to learn something, you're probably not going to remember what you learned quite as well. What about the opposite kind of drug that people would imagine, one that enhances memory encoding? The candidate here that you would naturally think of are stimulants, something like, Adderall or whatever that people often take, and they often take it thinking that it's going to help them learn and remember things. So what do we actually know there?
Yeah. So, okay. So this is interesting. So you take, these drugs that tend to activate the system, dopamine and norepinephrine. Again, there are reasons that the neuroadrenergic system can actually be less active. And, this is kind of a simplification, but generally speaking, we think of these drugs as activating. And, it turns out that it's not as easy to enhance memory encoding as people might think it is. People think that they're studying better. I think it's probably more that they do maintain focus to some degree, it seems to be. They also might help you restudy things over and over again because you're more perhaps interested in your work. But, it really seems to be if you have a deficit, then they work better. So if you have ADHD or if you're tired, I think that's when they work the best. But yeah, they tend to enhance memory encoding. So you encode information, I present to you a bunch of stimuli, I test your memory now 2 days later, and a lot of times you'll get this enhancement. What's interesting is that we didn't really show this enhancement in this massive reanalysis and review in healthy adults. And there could be a couple of reasons for that. I think that there's probably a pretty sharp inverted U that people who are already good probably don't need a very high dose to enhance their memory. And even then, maybe a low dose might still not do much or might even be counterproductive. And so I think that there's probably that. Like anybody who says, oh, Adderall doesn't help me, my guess is there's a dose at which that they probably could boost on it, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not telling anybody to take Adderall, I don't want to say that, but one thing we did show is that it enhances your meta memory. So this is the one thing I haven't talked about yet. This is how well you understand your own memory. So, for example, I might encode something and later on I might say, I've definitely seen this before. I'm unsure if I've seen it before. These drugs seem to enhance your ability to say, I've definitely seen it before when you actually have seen it before, or I definitely haven't seen this before when you haven't seen it before. Or for that matter, if you're like, I don't know if I've seen this, maybe I'll say, no, I didn't see this. And then your confidence is low. And it turns out you have seen that before, but your confidence is low. That's also good meta memory, because even though you got that wrong, you kind of knew not to be very confident. And so this is something that we showed was that this is, I think, to my knowledge, maybe the first time that we showed that an aspect of metacognition was enhanced, how well you understand your own cognition with these drugs. And so, yeah, I mean, that was, something that, again, I think that they can enhance different cognitive processes, including memory encoding, but it's maybe not as great as we would hope that it would be. But they at least enhance perhaps your meta memory, which gives you kind of this gauge. And this is why actually, for example, people are studying while they're on, Adderall, and then they try to maybe test themselves. They're like, I don't think I know that information very well. Who knows if I'll remember it later? I should study it again, and so it kind of gives you this better gauge of knowing. So even if it doesn't enhance your actual cognition, it enhances your ability to understand your own cognition, at least in terms of memory. Whether or not it's true of other aspects of cognition, like perceptual decision-making or whatever is yet to be shown. But that was a pretty consistent effect that we found. And, just to skip up here a little bit, we showed that amphetamine also enhances your meta memory when it's on board during memory retrieval. So if you're retrieving a memory and you're like, have I seen this or not yet? I think so, and it turns out you're wrong, but you had low confidence. That's again a good aspect of, even though you were wrong, you were low confident. You kind of knew not to be too confident in an incorrect decision.
So people tend to become better at gauging the confidence level or accuracy of their own memories.
the correspondence between confidence and accuracy essentially is how we measure metacognition here, and specifically meta memory in this study. So, but yeah, the point though is that if you give the drug though on board during encoding, it definitely did not impair memory. The enhancements were kind of, trending sometimes, and other people have shown enhancements in certain areas. Whether it's recollection or familiarity is still kind of unclear to me. Definitely, some people have shown recollection-based tasks, so like free recall of words. That's probably recollection hippocampally dependent. Recognition, not always shown. So anyways, yeah, you get some enhancement. But now if you take a drug like psychedelics, this is, I think, where things get a little interesting. So you administer a psychedelic, you show people a bunch of stimuli, you test their memory 2 days later. As I mentioned, psychedelics bind to the serotonin 2A receptor. Those tend to be mostly distributed on excitatory neurons. So you should get activation, facilitation, and yet you get impairments in memory. So this is one place in which they're unique, where it's like, wait a minute, all these drugs that, facilitate inhibition in some ways, whether they're, cutting off excitation or they're actually facilitating your inhibitory system, they impair memory encoding. And here's psychedelics where they enhance, excitatory neurotransmission in some ways, and yet they're impairing memory encoding. So what's going on here? And I think if you just stopped at, using a verbal free recall task, which is here's a bunch of words, how many can you recall later? You wouldn't get down to the bottom of this. And I think that's why we need better cognitive psychologists in this field that can really dig deeper into these questions of behavior, so that we don't have non-experimental psychologists saying, it's all just generalized disengagement, which is, the biggest cop-out explanation I've ever seen from somebody who doesn't understand cognitive psychology. And so there's a couple things here. One is that if you look at, there was a study done by Fred Barrett, who I work with. He showed that dextromethorphan and psilocybin, he had a very high dose of dextromethorphan. I think it was 400 milligrams, which keep in mind, you maybe take maximum 30 milligrams if you're going to take something to stop your cough. So quite a bit. And then he had 3 doses of psilocybin, a kind of on the low moderate side, a moderately high side, and then a very high dose. So 10, 20, and 30 milligrams. This is all per 70 kilograms, but let's forget that. This is approximately 10, 20, and 30, and then approximately 400 milligrams. And so of dextromethorphan. And so in this study, what he showed was that if you look at just verbal free recall, so again, here's a list of words. How many can you recall like 10 minutes later or something like that? And it actually, in his case, I think he did it 5 hours later. So when most of the drug effects are gone, but you could say that some are still there, we're now trying to do the study where we actually have people test their memory 1 day later to make sure that there's no drug effects during retrieval. That dextromethorphan, it ended up impairing very strongly episodic memory. Surprise, surprise, you block the NMDA receptor. If we think that LTP is kind of the scaffolding by which these episodic memories are formed. And then you disrupt that scaffolding with the NMDA receptor, which is very much involved in LTP. Boom, you massively hit, episodic memory. But what was interesting was that there was a working memory task. I'm glad that probably none of my working memory friends are going to listen to this, because they would get mad at me if I said that the NBAC was working memory. I agree with them. I'm just going to simplify things and say that the NBAC is working memory. It's really this task that involves multiple processes, as do most, but it's not a great working memory task is the point. But it's an aspect of working memory, executive functioning. And you didn't get an impairment at all. I think it wasn't significant. Like, I'm sure if they'd run more subjects, whatever, they would have gotten it, but it wasn't significant. And so the NBAC is essentially this task in which, let's say I do a 2-back specifically. You have to say with every stimulus that you see, is it the same as 2 behind you? So I show you L, N, M. You're going to say no to the L because you had nothing before it. You're going to say no to the N. You're going to say no to the M. And then I say N, L, N, M, N. And you're going to say yes, because behind that 2-back, there was now an N. And so this involves working memory, which means keeping things in mind, like kind of like a phone number. I give you a phone number, 555-3212, and you're like, okay, 555-3212, 555. You're holding that in mind at that time. If you can recall it the next day, now you're relying on episodic memory. If you've been recalling that information for a really long time, and I take your hippocampus out, and you can still remember it, that's probably semantic memory now. So what they showed was that, essentially that this NMDA antagonist at a high dose dextromethorphan it massively impaired episodic memory encoding. It did not really impair working memory, at least significantly. And there's actually a lot of studies I've noticed since then that also didn't show such working memory impairments from ketamine and other NMDA antagonists. again, higher doses, more subjects, I'm sure that they would. But here's the interesting thing. You now give psilocybin, and the impact on episodic memory on free recall was there, but it wasn't quite strong. So just recalling words off the top of your head 5 hours after your psilocybin session, after you'd seen all these words under these 3 different doses. However, those 3 different, and I think the lowest dose might not even have impacted free recall, if I remember correctly. But if you look at working memory, this NBAC task, even the lowest dose impacted working memory significantly. And definitely your moderately high dose and your really high dose did. So again, generalized disengagement.
So it impaired working memory?
Yeah, you get the, and again, I'm simplifying what working memory, executive function, whatever the NBAC is thought to tap into. It's not episodic memory though. And yeah, you get this impairment from psychedelics that you don't get with dissociatives that are quite as strong. Whereas it's the other way around with episodic memory, where you don't get as strong of an impact in episodic memory encoding from psychedelics, but you do with the dissociatives. This is a perfect example of why you can't say that it's generalized disengagement under psychedelics. Psychedelics are special, that you can't test, you can't do behavioral tasks and cognitive paradigms. People just disengage. It's like, wait a minute. If people just disengage, then shouldn't just across all tasks, you get larger impairments from psychedelics than you do with something like dextromethorphan? Clearly not, because you get this dissociation. But now here's where things get even more interesting. So you can do a recognition memory task. So now I can show you a bunch of things you've seen and things you haven't seen. And I ask you to say, did you see this? Yes or no? And you'll say yes, no, to things that you've seen and not seen. And then I ask you to rate your confidence. Now, using this confidence, I can now model things like recollection and familiarity. There's other ways of modeling recollection and familiarity, but this is one way of doing it. You get an impairment of recollection, but there's no impact on familiarity, even as you escalate that dose to that massively high dose, 30 milligrams, where people are barely functional. No impact on familiarity, unlike what you see with the GABA positive allosteric modulators, 15 milligrams of THC, which is, moderate, but not like super high. And with NMDA antagonists, which as you move those up the dose, you'll definitely see impairments of familiarity. In fact, what we saw here with psilocybin was potential enhancements. As in, at the highest dose, that p-value started to get the lowest. The moderate dose, it wasn't quite there. The lowest dose, it wasn't there at all. But the point is, no impact on familiarity, if anything, numerical enhancements. My MDMA study, same thing. MDMA, we showed that recollection impaired. In the original study, I did not focus on what happened to familiarity. I didn't believe it. It wasn't until I saw these psilocybin data where I was like, wait a minute, I've seen this before. And I was like, holy shit, like we might actually be getting an enhancement of familiarity that's now shown up. That numerical enhancement of familiarity, again, with MDMA, I think with one situation, depending on the stimuli, with emotional stimuli, it was trending or significant. With neutral stimuli, it wasn't there. It was this weird sort of thing where emotional stimuli essentially give you, I think, better signal sometimes. But yeah, again, impairment of recollection, maybe even enhancement of familiarity. The point is, no other drug, when you start upping the dose, starts to enhance familiarity. If anything, you get more impairments of familiarity. So you can see a potential enhancement. And here's where it makes sense. Maybe, this is, again, me, just massive speculation. Familiarity is based out of the cortex, the fluency of activation through perceptual and semantic networks. That's where you have these layer 5 pyramidal neurons that have serotonin 2A receptors that can now drive this facilitation. However, the entorhinal cortex, the entrance to the hippocampus, is now where there's these inhibitory serotonin 2A receptors. This wall of inhibition is potentially now being facilitated. And so now you're not allowing information to the hippocampus, which is going to impair your recollection, but perhaps enhance your familiarity, which is going to enhance things like noetic quality that one gets, feelings of insight, deja vu, whatever. And so it was kind of this neat story. We're waiting to see it replicated. We're doing one of the studies that will hopefully show some kind of replication. We're also working with some people at Maastricht to try to see with a couple different psychedelics what we end up seeing in terms of recollection and familiarity. So it's interesting. I think the point, though, is that even if you have familiarity in the absence of recollection, you still can't control that familiarity with recollection. And it can, even if you don't enhance familiarity, having too much familiarity in the absence of recollection can also result in some of these bizarre phenomena. That's kind of my working model for this.
Yeah. So this brings up the area of thinking about how psychedelics like psilocybin, for example, acting through these 5-HT2A receptors, which are found in abundance in these special excitatory neurons in certain parts of the cerebral cortex. This brings us to the idea of what is actually functionally going on in the human brain when you take something like psilocybin, and how does that start to tie to some of the potential therapeutic effects? So I know that you've worked on this and others have worked on it over the last few years, including some recent studies looking at, functional imaging in the brains of people who take psilocybin versus other drugs. What do we know? What's the current state of knowledge on what a dose of psilocybin will cause to happen functionally in the human brain?
Yeah. I think this is such a hard question. You can go off of so much. There's a bunch of different models, and I realize that there's one that everybody, is kind of bending over backwards to make their data fit. And that's, Rebus, or the default mode network narrative is what I like to call it. So, maybe I should start with that one. And so there's this idea that your brain is composed of these hierarchies, and, that's not totally absurd. You have sensory processing that goes through early visual areas, through more complex visual areas. You go from processing edges, just lines, to eventually processing, a face. And then, these certain neurons are very responsive to faces rather than just edges. And so that makes sense. And then you have these regions that are responsive to multiple different senses. They're not just responsive to vision, they're also responsive to audition, et cetera. And so you have this hierarchy in the brain, and that it's the top of the brain's hierarchy is the default mode network. And that this is according to this model. And psychedelics especially hit the default mode network, and then the hierarchy kind of breaks down, and now there's more bottom-up information processing. And so this might, you might say, well, this makes sense, that familiarity is this bottom-up process, this activation of cortical regions. As I say this, I'm just like, I can't make sense of this. I'm not even going to try to bend over backwards like some people do to make that
I was
work.
about to start asking questions.
Yeah, because familiarity, you can say, okay, well, there's certain perceptual fluency activation, but as I mentioned, it's also very much involved in semantic concept activation, which is a high level. Well, and this is where this model breaks down, actually, is that when they talk about different, so Robin Carhart-Harris is not an experimental psychologist. He's not a cognitive psychologist. He's he's mentioned things on Twitter that kind of talk down on cognition, and he's also a trained in Freudian psychology. I think he has a master's in psychoanalysis. And so Freudian psychology and cognitive psychology don't exactly get along. And so one difference is that cognitive psychology takes empirical observations and manipulations, and typically what we call science, and tries to look for consistencies. Freudian psychology starts with ideas and tries to look for them in patients. And that's, basically what Freud did, was until he found the patient that proved his idea, he didn't, that's what he started with an idea, and he kept trying to look for it in patients that proved his idea. You want to bang your mother. He kept finding the patients that, wanted to bang their mothers. So anyways, I think that but one issue is that if you take proper behavior, these proper cognitive processes, Rebus breaks down this idea. So one idea is that your lower level processes are facilitated while your higher level processes are impaired. The lower level processes are at least unimpaired or facilitated. And so, one could say, well, the perceptual aspects of familiarity, those are enhanced. The perceptual fluency is enhanced, but the semantic fluency isn't. Well, semantic priming has been shown to be enhanced by psychedelics. There's also the example that they'll always use in Rebus is that, well, you have contrast processing versus motion processing. Contrast comes first in the visual hierarchy. You're a vision person, is that right?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. And so, I think V1 or 2 does contrast, then it takes essentially
contrast is
MT.
a very basic thing that most organisms with a visual apparatus of any kind can do.
Yeah, but so is motion processing, but it does seem to come later, right? And so area MT comes later on in the stream versus contrast. And so what they'll show is that motion processing is impaired by psychedelics, but contrast isn't. Actually, what's a really cool finding is I found one paper with alcohol that finds the flip of that. And now that makes that a lot more interesting. If you think about it, you're like, oh, what if all drugs just do that? And you're like, wait a minute, alcohol actually impairs contrast more than motion. Okay, now this makes this interesting. But that's one example where that does work, where it's like the higher level process is now impaired compared to the lower level process. But you could think of pre-pulse inhibition. This is a single, let's say a puff of air to your eye, or a loud sound, let's say. And then if I play a second loud sound in close sequentially, that first sound is going to inhibit the response to the second sound, because it's almost like a very rudimentary form of learning. It's like the second sound is like, all right, I already heard that first one. I know that there could be a next one coming up. It becomes predictive in some ways to inhibit that response, almost like a form of familiarity, let's say. Well, pre-pulse inhibition is impaired by psychedelics, especially when the distance between the two pulses is near. And so that's a very low level form of learning. And that's one of the first things Mark Geyer and others have been showing, that is like the psychedelics impair this. It's like, okay, other forms of low level learning that are now being impaired versus enhanced. Like, I don't think fear conditioning is enhanced, but yet extinction learning is. And so they'll use that as an example. Oh, extinction learning gets enhanced by psychedelics. It's like, what about fear conditioning? I don't think that's enhanced. That's a low level form of learning. And so it just becomes this really weird thing that, I don't know what's a low level and higher level in a lot of forms of behavior that can really, explain some of these effects. And then they'll say, oh, cognitive flexibility, which cognitive flexibility is probably an extremely high level. They're like, oh, this gets enhanced, which, by the way, it doesn't. It's unfortunate that this has now been written into the literature, that it's now been shown in animals and in humans that acutely psychedelics impair cognitive flexibility, so your ability to adaptively switch between cognitive operations in a changing environment. And this is probably a high level process that actually is one reason why I think humans are successful, is that we have high cognitive flexibility. We can go from, attention to outward world. Okay. Internal attention, let's revisit our models, outward, internal, all these different ways of sort of thinking that can allow us to solve different problems. And acutely psychedelics, that is a high level process that psychedelics do impair. So if any of that goes with the model, but oddly enough, they say in their papers but psychedelics enhance unconventional cognitive processes like cognitive flexibility, a high level process. And the reason they say that is because antagonism of those receptors in animals has been shown to impair cognitive flexibility. So the inference is, if you agonize the receptors, it should enhance them. And yet that has not been shown to be true. So this is my take on Rebus anyways, is why I don't totally buy it. But from a brain level, maybe just let me go real quick and say this. The idea is that you should get larger effects in these areas, that it does turn out that these higher level association cortices that process multiple senses and not just visual, cortex and whatnot, they do have more serotonin 2A receptors generally. It's worth mentioning that compared to the rest of the brain, sensory areas still have a lot of serotonin 2A receptors. But the point that they like to make is that, you get a decrease in default mode network functional connectivity, or you get entropy in the default mode network. That is the network that a lot of times gets the lowest, the smallest effect. And in fact, in their LSD data, the largest effects that you get on decreases in functional connectivity or increases in entropy are in sensory networks, and the smallest effects are in the default mode network sometimes. And this has now been shown across, I think Natasha Mason had some psilocybin data, Matthias Leichte has some LSD data, and across all of these studies, it's like the default mode network is not the locus of the largest effects, and sensory areas do get nearly, if not larger effects, which complete opposite of what you'd expect if the hierarchy is broken and sensory areas are now supposed to be facilitated in some ways.
Let's back up for people for a minute. So can you, let's see if you can answer three questions or describe what the state of thinking is here. So one, just what is the default mode network in very simple terms? Two, what is the effect that psilocybin tends to have, and how well does it replicate in terms of how it's impacting the default mode network? And lastly, is psilocybin and are other psychedelics unique in the way they affect the default mode network, or do other drugs do something similar?
This is great. I'm glad you mentioned that last point, because, one of the things I've been trying to say throughout this, and this whole paper, the reason why we kind of brought up this discussion is the idea is there something unique about different types of drugs, right? Okay, so the first question is, what's the default? So the default mode network is actually basically the episodic memory network. Recollection, maybe more so than anything, if you include the hippocampus, posterior hippocampus especially. So they form this, some people refer to as the posterior medial network, but it's involved in episodic memory. It's not your ego, your sense of self. I think Phineas Gage had a rod that went through, especially I think dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's not part of the default mode network. His sense of self was certainly changed. Although, you could argue that it went through multiple areas, but the default mode network is involved in various areas that have nothing to do with the opposite of your sense of self, which is the processing of others and what they're thinking, theory of mind. That's essentially the opposite of your sense of self. It's involved in future simulation. It's involved in, I think the one kind of takeaway is it's involved in kind of internal models of the world, I think might be a better way of describing maybe what the default mode network could be doing. And even then, I'm sure somebody could prove me wrong and give me an example of where that's not true, but it's definitely not your ego. And so that's kind of a weird thing. And it's certainly not the case that your id is subcortical structures, because I think that's another thing that kind of is proposed by the entropic brain. These subcortical structures, I should mention, are not, they're a lot of times connected to these other networks. As I mentioned, the posterior hippocampus is connected very much so to your default mode network, and is almost part of that same sort of network. They co-evolved with different areas of your cortex. And so there's nothing primitive about your thalamus isn't necessarily more primitive than other areas. So that's what the default network might do. Your second question is, what does psychedelics do to the default mode network? Is that right?
The psilocybin reliably affect the default mode network in a particular direction.
And that is one thing that does turn out to be true. So now there's been several data sets not even just resting state data sets, but they do show that psychedelics decrease functional connectivity within the default mode network. And that does turn out to be true. You also get decreases in functional connectivity in other networks pretty reliably, other higher level cortical networks, such as,
And what does that mean to decrease functional connectivity?
So that would be, you could think about your network. So your brain's communicating, how your different regions of your brain are communicating to each other. They might now, they form these networks. That's kind of how you describe a network. Is generally there's more communication within this network than outside of it. And you now get less communication within this network. And so essentially what it really boils down to is just a correlation between the activity of two regions over time. So two regions are co-activated, high functional connectivity. If they're doing their own thing and not talking, they're not talking to each other. One region's up, the other region's down, et cetera. It's a bad example. One region's up, the other region's only sort of up, then you're going to have a not very high functional connectivity. So it has been reliably shown. But here's the thing. If you're going to call that ego dissolution, as some do, you should then expect other ego dissolving drugs. And this now brings us to other drugs. What do they do to the default mode network? Well, our most similar example to psychedelics would probably be the dissociatives and ketamine. The great thing about ketamine is it's been studied quite a bit because it's legal, and you can get these big studies. You can get people who aren't invested in the psychedelic effects of ketamine to do these studies, et cetera, et cetera. And the studies are almost certainly better quality than our psychedelic studies. So they have larger samples. They'll have between different universities. So you now have multi-site. So it's not just specific to one area and maybe one set of researchers priming people to do something or whatever it is. Ketamine, there's been 5 studies I've seen with resting state ketamine. 2 have shown decreases in default mode network connectivity. 2 have shown no effect. 1 has shown increases in default mode network connectivity. So that's already a problem, if you ask me. And, I think one reason, which, I don't want to go into this too much, is the idea of resting state. We have people do whatever they want in the scanner under a drug. You're now, especially with like 20 people, you're getting a random sample of cognitive operations. In one sample, a bunch of people might think of their mom, and they're going to now get one pattern of activity that's going to interact with drug effects. Another sample is going to perhaps be paranoid what the researcher wants, and that's going to interact with drug effects. Another sample is going to listen to those scanner sounds really intently. Maybe they're going to get more sensory changes. That's a good point, because correct me if I'm wrong, in a lot of these brain imaging studies, right, you're comparing what's going on in the brain in 2 different conditions. And condition 1 is often the so-called resting state, the baseline state. They just sort of sit there and do nothing, quote unquote. But what you're saying is, instead of, it's not like, if you've got 10 people in a study and they're all in their baseline resting state, they're not all in the same state. One of them's remembering what they did at the grocery store yesterday. The other one's thinking about how nervous they are in this claustrophobic image scanner. And you're sort of treating all of those distinct cognitive states as one common baseline almost. Yeah. And that's the thing. There's no baseline to the brain, And so that's the issue. And then here's the funny thing is you're comparing while they're on drugs and they can't fall asleep because these drugs prevent people from falling asleep. You're now comparing this situation where they're doing whatever they want. things that they actually have the capacity to do when they're sober too. Let's keep that in mind. You can think about your mother when you're sober. You can be paranoid what the researcher wants out of you when you're sober. You can pay attention to the scanner sounds when you're sober. And now you're comparing that to a situation when you're on placebo, when you're actually probably resting. And in fact, 40% of samples will fall asleep, at least according to one study. So what are you really comparing here? You're comparing an aroused state to an unaroused state. You're comparing cognitive operations for which people have the capacity when they're sober to a situation when they're actually resting, even if they don't fall asleep. And then you tell people to close their eyes during some of these things. Of course, they're going to fall asleep when they're sober. So it's just like this ill-fated comparison, if you ask me. But okay, so there's that. Now, what about other drugs? Amphetamine and alcohol have both been shown to decrease default mode network connectivity. So the default mode network tends to come online when people aren't performing externally directed attention sort of tasks. Well, when the default mode network decreases its activity, that's when you're performing externally directed tasks. Well, guess what you're going to do when you're under the effects of drugs? Amongst all that random amalgamation of cognitive operations, you're probably going to more likely direct your attention outwards occasionally here and there. That's going to result in more decreases in default network connectivity. Even if you're drunk, you're probably going to do that more frequently than just, introspect and just sit there and think internally. And so
you're saying, so just to make sure I got it, you're saying that a reliable result is that stimulants, for example, decrease default mode network activity.
One study has shown that. And there's been one study that shows alcohol that I've found. Maybe there could be more, but yeah, that's what I have seen thus far.
But certainly no one would ever conclude that, taking a stimulant is causing ego dissolution.
Of course not. If anything, that's ego strengthening. I think same thing with alcohol. People can become egotistical, let's say. And so it's just this like, what does this even mean? And I think, Robin himself has backed off of some of the default mode network stuff. And it just sucks that he doubled down in Rebus when his LSD data didn't really show that. And now people are always talking about the default mode network, including scientists who, they're not usually brain. Actually, even some of the brain scientists are now focusing on the default mode network. And it's just like, God damn it. Like, this is an unfortunate side to, what we've gone through here. But maybe here, look, if you gave me a lesion patient that has, let's say, a hub of the default mode network taken out, like the posterior cingulate or the medial prefrontal cortex, and you give them a psychedelic and most of the effects are gone, but this doesn't happen if you have a lesion of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex or the dorsal anterior cingulate, I'm going to eat my words. I'm going to be like, you know what? You're right. The default mode network does seem to be the most important thing to psychedelic drug effects. But till that happens, at the moment, the fMRI data do not speak to this default mode network account. And so, I can go into other types of models and things that could be happening. One idea is, just this idea of general plasticity increasing, and maybe this plasticity is associated with weird phenomena. I think that, you have your thalamus as well, that seems to be, it gates certain types of information. You have kind of top-down processes that prevent certain things from getting in. For example, you don't want every single pixel in this wall to be seen as all the colors that are actually reflecting off, and you want to see kind of a solid wall. Maybe that now gets disrupted because the thalamus processes sensory information. And so there's this idea that you can get, it actually involves disinhibition. I'm debating whether or not to go into that because now we might be going off topic from the memory stuff, but it's up to you.
I don't think we really need to go there, but can you just say a little bit as we wrap up here about, what's going on in your world or the psychedelic research world to do with the effects of psychedelics on memory? Are there any questions you're pursuing right now or any interesting pursuits from other folks?
Yeah. So I guess I don't know about what others are doing, but yeah, we want to replicate that effect of, do psychedelics enhance the encoding of cortically dependent familiarity-based memories, while impairing recollection-based memories. I think something else that was interesting that came out, this is something that was shown in animals, is if you administer a psychedelic immediately after encoding, you can actually enhance the proxy to a familiarity-based memory. This is novel object recognition. And recently it was shown, I might've been a reviewer on this paper, that there was this interesting finding where they talk about what happens the next day after psychedelics, and you get this enhancement of memory. And I was like, wait a minute, actually, no, that's not exactly what you showed. What they had people do was they had a grid. It was maybe like a 4x4 grid with cards, and you flip over one card and that's the can. You flip over another card and it's something else, and you got to find where the other can is. And you have several trials of learning this to like learning this to a point where it becomes almost familiarity based and not recollection based, Then they administered LSD afterwards. And then the following day, they then had enhancements of that task. That's basically the animal version of novel object recognition. In other words, administering a drug post-encoding, a psychedelic, might enhance the consolidation of some of these memories, which is a crazy idea that administering post-encoding is going to enhance. That's been shown only with GABA A positive allosteric modulators. So this is a very weird thing that this is where, again, if you might hate the way I group sedatives all together, Ambien, benzos, and alcohol. If you study on them, you're not going to remember anything the next day for your test. If you study and take them immediately afterwards, you'll remember more for your test than had you not taken them at all. Let's forget about hangovers for a second. But yeah, that's like, it's known as retrograde facilitation. It's one of the craziest effects. People talk about psychedelics. Sedatives have some really cool effects like retrograde facilitation, waking people up out of comas. That's a crazy thing that happens with benzos and Ambien. It's and then of course you have a GABA agonists that have their own hallucinogenic effects. So, anyway, psychedelics might do that. That's not been shown. And so there's a really simple explanation for retrograde facilitation, which probably isn't the whole story. If you take something after you encode, you're going to block new information from coming in that can interfere with the old information. So it's been shown if I learn list A and then I learn list B is going to interfere with my memory for list A. Had I just sat there and done nothing at all, list A is going to be remembered better. If I do list A and then I can't remember anything that I learned from list B, well, it can't interfere with list A, right? So that was a simple explanation. However, there's some really weird things that happen that can't fully explain that. One, a drug like THC, it doesn't work. THC also impairs memory. It doesn't work. Two, you get disproportionate memory for certain types of stimuli like emotional information sometimes. Three, you get enhancements of sleep-based consolidation processes. So there's some of these stabilization processes that exist during sleep. This has only been shown with Ambien. So I don't know if it shows up with alcohol and benzodiazepines, and you don't need sleep for this to work. But at least you can show that you get enhanced sleep spindles and the coupling of sleep spindles to slow waves. And so those are usually associated with enhancements in episodic memory. So anyways, it's psychedelics, who knows what they're doing, but there's this post-encoding psychedelic that could enhance your memory. And in fact, what we're seeing with familiarity, it might just be because psychedelics are lingering into the consolidation phase, that it might have nothing to do with the encoding effect. And so that would be something I'm super interested in. I think the last thing with episodic memory that I would want to do is look at their effects, psychedelics effects during memory retrieval. So most drugs, when administered during retrieval, will increase false memories. So you will falsely say with high confidence that you saw something that you never actually did, including very crazy stimuli that you would normally think that I would remember that, like a picture of a dying baby. That's literally a stimulus that we've used before. And you'll say, yeah, I saw a picture of a dying baby. No, you didn't. Wouldn't you have thought that you would remember that stimulus? You'll say with high confidence, right? And so that shows up. The THC has been the one to show that the most. So this is kind of gets at the importance of dissociating drug effects between encoding and retrieval and consolidation and whatnot. There was a study back in the 70s, 1970, I think, that showed if you administer THC just during retrieval, you will get an increase in how often you're going to false alarm to certain types of stimuli. You'll be like, oh yeah, I'm more likely to say, yes, I saw the stimuli when I never actually did. After that, most studies administered THC during memory encoding and then tested their memory shortly afterwards while THC was still on board during retrieval. They'll get impairments in true memory. You're less able to say what you've actually seen. You'll get increases in false memory. And for reasons I can't go into, but involve signal detection theory, if your memory is really bad, you'll get impairments in true memory and increases in false memory because you're just going to be guessing, right? And if you're just guessing, you're going to say yes to some things you've seen, but also haven't seen, and then you're going to say no to things that you have seen, but also haven't seen. And so that false memory effect was basically forgotten about. And people were like, this is just all due to this impairment of true memory. And then we came along later and then we showed just during retrieval, if you give THC, you get this increase in false memories. It shows up across multiple tasks, high confidence, false alarms. People will use the high confidence button. And we didn't realize that there was this paper from 1970 and I stupidly didn't cite it. And then somebody sent it to me later and I was like, oh shit, I'm an idiot. And so anyways, it's important to dissociating drug effects from encoding and retrieval, but it turns out that shows up with amphetamine. We saw trending effects with MDMA. I regret doing this modeling and saying that MDMA might impact true memory when really I think what was happening was that modeling approach is sensitive to false memories. And if you get too much false memories, you get a decrease in a true memory parameter. It's again, complicated to explain, but again, we see this trend towards increased false memories with MDMA, especially for high confidence false memories. And yeah, you see it with amphetamine. And then my guess is with something like psychedelics, you would as well, which suggests, again, we should be cautious with psychedelics. And this idea of repressed memories is mostly garbage. And so psychedelics might instead enhance the ability to retrieve false memories or form false memories. And, this is something that I'd like to test in the future.
Awesome. Well, Manoj Doss, thank you for your time.
Yeah, I guess it's been 2 hours, man. All right. Have a good one, man.